During one of our live sessions here on the channel, I got requests from quite a few people asking to share some tips on how to sew clothes on the bias. So in this video, we're going to find out the best tips for working with clothes on the bias. So if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's go. Hello, my name's Juliet Uzor of sewsonatural.com, a place for people who love to create their own clothes, own their style, and shamelessly and fearlessly showcase them for everyone to see. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, do not forget to subscribe to the channel. So as we may or may not know, in order to add drape and a lovely flow to any kind of item of garment you're sewing, it's really nice to cut it on the bias, cutting it across the grain. So it's normally at a 45-degree angle of a piece of fabric, and that adds just a little bit of stretch, not a little bit, actually stretches out the fabric when you cut it along that direction. Normally you would have patterns asking you to place your fabric along the grain line, but in this case we're going against the grain line, and that's how you add drape to your garments. So when you're starting off working with clothes on the bias, my favorite tip to tell everyone who asks me is to go simple, okay? Start simple and get fancy later. It's best not to have too many details, so stick to just like minimal detail, like detailing on the type of fabric you're working with, detailing in the type of pattern that you're going to be working with. So as simple as possible really does help you to wrap your head around the idea of working with fabrics on the bias. Please stay away from directional print when you are working on the bias, because you're going to have things going in different directions. So in order to avoid any kind of mishaps when you're working on the bias, go with a fabric in a solid color or all over print type of fabric. If you can, stay away from like really bold prints, because it gets quite hard matching them when you are creating a seam. So moving on to when you've got your fabrics all cut out, I love to stabilize any tricky seam lines. So if I've got a seam that I think might stretch out, like necklines, especially necklines on a wrap kind of top. So if you've got a wrap style neckline, you will have that fabric stretching out and you'd have some gaping when the garment is worn. In order to avoid that garment from gaping, try to stabilize that neckline. You want to stabilize the neckline by using lightweight interfacing. Well, it all depends on what type of fabric you're working with, but your interfacing needs to go nicely with the type of fabric you're choosing. So if you're working with knit fabrics, then opt for some stretchy interfacing. But if you're working with woven fabric, then your basic interfacing or like woven interfacing would be fantastic to use. So just like cut out a strip and add it to that area that you're going to be stitching together, just to avoid any kind of stretching out and just getting your fabric out of shape. But before you even go ahead, please stay stitch the areas before you create the seams. It would stop your fabric from stretching out of control. But then sometimes I find that when I have a solid color fabric and I want to create a wrap neckline, what I do is I have that wrap as close as possible along the grain line, just to minimize any kind of stretching. But it all depends on what type of fabric you're working with. If that fabric has an all over print, or if it has a directional print and you think it will not match, then don't do that. If I have like a cutout at the back, I like to place that cutout part along the grain line just to minimize the amount of stretching that I could have when that neckline is finished. So a lot of home sewers have this habit of pulling fabrics from both sides while sewing. It's sort of a comforting thing because it makes you feel reassured that your fabric is going to be sewn in a straight line. But when you're working along the bias and you are stitching, please do not pull the fabric, because pulling it will change the shape of it and distort your seams. And just gently guide your fabric through the machine as you sew. This part is so annoying because you're getting closer to the end of your project and you take it to your pressing station. Do not press, backwards and forwards. You need that upward and downward motion when you press your fabrics rather than stretching them out of shape. So that up and down pressing motion is extremely important to avoid your fabric from stretching out of shape. So before you actually hem your garments, hang it up on a mannequin or a hanger and leave it for a day or two before going ahead to hem it. Preferably a rolled hem or a narrow hem. Those are much better than using a wider hem. As with all other sewing projects that you normally do, I'm sure you must have heard this tip from lots of people. Please press your seams as you go, as much as possible. So rather than leaving everything right at the end, press those seams as you go, and you would end up with a beautifully made garment. I have a few videos here that will share with you some excellent tips and tricks for when you are creating any kind of clothes, and I hope to see you over at those videos. All the very best. Take care.